Hello, BookTube. Recently, there's been a spate of videos here where people go through lists of the top 15, 18, 20 books in a certain subgenre of fiction that they are going to read next or soon, that they really need to either reread, sometimes after a lapse of decades, or read for the first time because the work is so well known, so influential. And I have loved watching those videos, but they have left me with the feeling that perhaps what we need here is a good old-fashioned list of essentials. Of essential reading. I have chosen fantasy to start off with. I'm going to give you a list here of absolutely essential fantasy reads with a few caveats. Caveat number one, overwhelmingly more important than any others, is that something doesn't have to be essential for you to like it. And you don't only have to like essential things. This is not at all a comment on the fantasy that you read and like. You could have read none of the books that I'm going to show you and want to read none of them, but still read fantasy all day long and love it, and there would be absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I'm talking about is the anxiety of influence. What I'm talking about is parentage, provenance. I'm talking, like I did with the Western Canon starter kit, I'm talking about here things that are either creating huge parts of the basic architecture that the fantasies, that the later fantasies that you enjoy make use of, or that break away from that standard architecture in order to do new things that will influence later fantasies. That's all I'm saying here. That's caveat number one. Caveat number two is that I'm often including works here that are multiple volumes. I'm including them to one heading. They will be one entry rather than 10 or however long the series is. And caveat number three is that sometimes in the subgenre of fantasy, the work involved wobbles really close to the line between fantasy and science fiction. And it was unavoidable that I put some of those books on this list. Some of you who've watched my channel for a long time will know, and you science fiction and fantasy fans will be horrified to remember, that I don't think there's all that much difference between the two, except nomenclature. If you are traveling 50,000 light years in the blink of an eye, it really doesn't matter to me whether you're using an FTL drive or Gandalf's wizard staff. Neither one exists in reality, and neither one ever could exist in reality. So it's really, to me, just a flavor, the gewgaws and gimcracks that you populate your story with. But I understand that it does make a very big difference. That flavor does make a big difference. So I've tried to avoid that wobbly place in the middle. You'll see that I didn't succeed. Several of the books on this list, I'm sure, people would put on their top science fiction list. I left out obvious cases, which to me have always struck me as obvious cases. Something like The Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. Yes, it has valiant knights and fire-breathing dragons, but it's entirely science fiction. There isn't any magic in it. There isn't any hint of magic in it. There's plenty of stuff that the current residents of the book don't understand, but the reader is never in the dark as to what that stuff is. So I'm leaving out stuff like that to the extent that I could. Some of the books on this list, it was unavoidable. And also, this won't only be oldies but goodies. There will be authors on here who are only recently dead. There will be authors on here who are still alive and still writing. That doesn't make them any the less essential. These are things that are absolutely essential for you to read in the fantasy subgenre. You can enjoy all that you want, but when it comes to knowing that subgenre, if you have not read these things, and I mean read them in recent memory, it's no good to me if you dimly crawled through them 30 years ago and can't remember a single thing about them. If you haven't read them recently, if you don't know them, then your intellectual weebos are wafting in the wind. Do you want your weebos to be wafting in the wind? I don't think so. So we're going to go through the essentials, and we're going to start with an example of two of those caveats. One, it is a compendium of many thin books. And two, it is an author who is of recent memory. Flowers fresh on the grave, that sort of thing. This is Roger Zelazny, and this is the Nine Princes in Amber series, the Books of Amber. Amber being his great locational creation of the reality, from which all other realities, including our own, are imperfect or warped refractions. And this reality is feudal and is ruled over by princes who are vying with each other. And again, I want to stress that you shouldn't just read the first book. You should read, the publishers very conveniently put it all together in one big book. You should get that. I'm sure you can get it relatively easily online. and read the whole of it. Just consider the thin little books to be chapters. Then we'll move from a great big book to a very small book, and also a doff of the hat to horror, because I'm not going to make an essentials list for horror, but some horror, I want to include it on the list. It comes close enough. It certainly has strong fantasy elements. And the example here would be The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is the lovely Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition, which is still available, still readily for sale. And these are very intelligent, very eloquent reworkings on old folktales. That is a popular subgenre now, a popular theme in fantasy writing now, but this, you'll never see it done better than Angela Carter. Then we'll move on to something that I want to underscore. I want this to underscore the fact that not every book on this list I'm putting on the list because of excellent prose. A little bit defensive about that myself. I can think of one booktuber who's more defensive about that, but I'm not putting everything on this list just because it's beautifully written. Obviously, or let's face it, Roger Zelazny, nice guy that he was, would not be on this list. This thing is fundamental, absolutely groundbreaking, and that is, of course, the Conan stories of Robert E. Howard. Here, this cover is from the big Gallant paperback that has all of the original Robert E. Howard Conan work, and none of the later pastiches, where editors sort of stirred the pot with their own stuff and weren't always clear, or were intentionally unclear, about where they stopped and Howard started. It is now possible, as it wasn't for years and years and years, it is now possible to read exactly what Robert E. Howard wrote concerning Conan. The stories, the fragments, all of it. And very much worth it. This is very much essential. If you are a fantasy fan and you have not read Robert E. Howard's Conan, I can almost unconditionally guarantee that you are reading fantasy that would not exist without this. So why not read this? Just to see what it is. This next one is a bit idiosyncratic, but this is my list, and I've been reading fantasy a long, long time, so I get to put some personal choices on this list that I consider to be essential. This is by John M. Ford, and it is The Dragon Waiting. And it is historical fantasy, a historical novel in which fantasy runs through the whole thing, or a fantasy novel that is set in history, with warriors and warring kingdoms and wizards and vampires, and it's wonderfully written. Just smartly, beautifully written, wonderfully understatedly done. So not on most people's lists of essentials, but definitely on mine. Then we'll move to YA. There were a whole bunch of YA titles that I could have put on this list. But I chose the one that I think is the most influential and also one of the best. These are the Earthsea books by Ursula Le Guin. And here we have them. This is the cover of a new hardcover illustrated edition. Relatively new, 5, 6, 10 years old. Still available in bookstores. And lovely, full of original illustrations. A big, oversized, thick, heavy hardcover. It'll set you back a penny or two at the bookstore, but it's worth it. And this is standard fantasy stuff with you see dragons on the cover there, but also archipelagos of warring kingdoms, magic being very real, but warm-hearted and ultimately very bright stuff. As opposed to our next one, which is not warm-hearted and not at all bright, but absolutely essential. These are the Alic Books of Michael Moorcock. This is the cover of a recent reissue that does lots and lots of important editorial work, but the point is to read all of the Elric, at least up to the first 6 books. And they're thin little things. They're crammed with ideas. They're crammed with invention. But they aren't long. A big Elric compendium would be no bigger if you include those first 6 yellow-spined DAW mass-market paperbacks. If you include those 6, they would be no bigger than that Gallant's Conan book. So again, don't stop with just one book. Although I shouldn't say that as an admonition, because in most of these cases, you're not going to want to stop. Anyway, same thing with this next one, which is the Farford and Grey Mouser series by Fritz Liber, which is a number of different books and short stories that have been collected into anthology volumes and whatnot. I chose here the cover of a new hardcover anthology of the adaptations of these that were done by the artist Mike Mignola. I've been waiting 40 years for those individual issues to be collected in one volume. I just assumed it was never going to happen. I think it is, or it has recently happened. And this is the cover to that. I'm not here recommending the graphic novel, although Mignola is a perfect choice to draw these things. Instead, I'm recommending the books. And again, not just one of them. Swords Against Devilry, Swords Against Death, Swords Against Ice Magic, all the way up to Knight and Knave of Swords. It's not a large body of work, but Liber's doing something new and interesting in every single one of those volumes. So if you are reading modern day fantasy about cynical sellswords or mismatched hero friends, you are reading things that are being done in the shadow of the light that was first unveiled by Fritz Liber in this format. These were hugely read, hugely influential. So if you're reading the knockoffs, you should read the original. Then when we're talking about knockoffs, that's one of the Achilles heels of the subgenre of fantasy just in general. It's often criticized, but especially tellingly by people who never read it, as being incredibly derivative. Somebody will come along with a great big book, it will be a real big success, and 100 people will come out of the woodwork writing barely disguised pastiches of that big book. I admit that this is a weakness in terms of the fantasy genre, and also in terms of science fiction. It's a weakness. But some books very pointedly set their star in a different direction. They very pointedly look to borrow as little as possible from their forebears in fantasy. And this next one, it's not just one book, it's 3 books, but it is a perfect example of that. This is His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, which is weird and anachronistic, a blend of animal familiars and steampunk and high philosophy. This is beautifully written. Pullman, when critics go at his work, they routinely say it, that if all fantasy could be written like this, we'd be fantasy fans. This is beautifully written. Steeply elusive, too. So the more you know about 200, 400 years of literature, the more you'll get out of this. But it's also a rousing adventure story with a main character, 2 main characters in the course of this trilogy that you're going to love to read about. So I strongly recommend it. This next one, boy, oh boy. His Dark Materials is collected in one volume work. It's been collected at least a couple of times. Look for the big fat blue trade paperback with a polar bear on the cover, and you won't be led astray. This next character, if there's a big, beautiful anthology of this character, I'm unaware of it. There could be. This is C.L. Moore, and this is Jiril of Jory. Her great historical sword and sorcery series, birthed at the exact same time and in the exact same venue as Robert E. Howard's Conan, as H.P. Lovecraft. C.L. Moore and Robert E. Howard were friends. They were correspondents. And he didn't try to imitate her writing style, which is very verbose and ornate, lovely. And she didn't try to imitate his. Instead, they were just respectful peers. This is less known than a lot of books on this list, but well worth your time. Strongly encourage it. Then we have the granddaddy of the whole subgenre, Lord Dunsany. This is his novel, The King of Elfland's Daughter, with a Darrell K. Sweet cover. You're almost going to think that Darrell K. Sweet is an entry on this list, considering how many covers he has. But what can I say? The guy gets around when it comes to fantasy covers. This is absolutely classic. It casts a shadow over all the rest of fantasy very much, including Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings borrows lines from this without changing them, lifts them wholesale out of homage on at least 2 separate occasions in the book. This is a story of a kingdom of men who want to change their king. And for that, they're going to need the King of Elfland and perhaps his daughter. It is incredibly poetic, incredibly touching. I strongly recommend it. I also recommend everything else this author wrote, including his short stories, which are amazingly good. Just amazingly good. Once upon a time, I would have said, boy, you should hunt around in the used bookstores for this cover. This Darrell K. Sweet cover is lovely. But unfortunately, you can't get it anymore, so you have to settle for whatever. But I just recently learned that Project Gutenberg, the online repository for ebooks that are in the common domain, they've had Lord Dunsany's works on there forever, but they've recently swapped out this for the cover of their version of The King of Elfland's Daughter. Whether they made an arrangement with Darrell K. Sweet's estate, or whether they just are trying it and are hoping they don't get caught or whatever, you can download this with this cover, the book with this cover, and boy, oh boy, should you. Absolutely you should. Almost everybody on this list worships at the altar of that author. So well worth reading that author. They're not mistaken. Then we have another Darrell K. Sweet cover. This is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. Classic high fantasy full of non-human characters, many of which are on this cover. Not my favorite Peter S. Beagle. I actually prefer A Fine and Private Place. I think it's a little bit more nuanced. It's certainly a lot less, bang the drummy than this. But this is his classic, absolutely. And also incredibly influential, so well worth your time. Then we have something new. This is a contemporary thing. This author is still writing. But nevertheless, when something's essential, I don't pay attention to when it was published. And this is, in terms of its influence, in terms of creating a whole vogue in the fantasy world, this is The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, which is very much along the lines of his Dark Materials in trying to be original, trying to present you with a whole panoply of fantasy constructs that don't have anything to do with Tolkien. Don't have anything to do with, there are nods, there are affectionate nods all over this book, but most of it feels fresh. And there's an immense, amazing narrative control in here. Almost from the very beginning, you feel that you are in the midst of a very beautifully worked out clockwork of a plot. To say the least, that is a vanishing trait in current fiction, in current fantasy included. But you get it here, that wonderful feeling of being cupped in the hand of a great storyteller. Then we have, speaking of great storytelling, this is, of course, the work that is synonymous with the fantasy subgenre. Of all the things on this list that are required reading, it is the most required, and that is, of course, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, here with just a red, plain cover. I know far too many fantasy fans who either haven't read this in a long, long time, or who have never read it. Fantasy fans, including some channels on BookTube that concentrate only on fantasy, who have never read The Lord of the Rings. And why? Usually when you poll them, it's because the first two books of this book, and the first two parts of this book, there's a bit of walking around. It's beautifully described. If you can't take a little bit of walking around, how do you plan on crawling your way on broken glass through the Malazan Book of the Fallen? Now, there are no good reasons not to persist with this, and there are a million reasons to read the whole thing, or to reread it, if you haven't. I might also point out that there is a guided chapter-by-chapter read-through of this book on this channel. But, of course, if I were making an essentials list and it only had one book on it, this would be it. But there's plenty more to go. Like, for instance, this is another example where it's multiple books that were conveniently assembled for you by the publisher. Unfortunately, the one-volume hardcover and the one-volume paperback that I've seen were poorly made. They probably would not withstand a solid, dedicated, passionate reading. They certainly wouldn't for me. But the individual books are available as well online, used. This is Evangeline Walton, and this is her Mabinogion books, where she adapts to fiction, to modern fiction conventions, the Welsh national mythological epic. That epic had grand set pieces, it has great imagery, but it doesn't have contemporary resonant character building, and this one does. This is heartbreaking and beautifully, beautifully written. This author actually wrote a few things that are worth your attention, but nothing more than this. This is essential. Then we'll move on to Arthurian pastiches. The pastiches are on the list, but I did not include Les Morts d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. I'm assuming because, I guess maybe naively, I'm assuming because all of you are familiar with it and all of you at least read a bit of it at school. If you haven't, consider it a ghost floating above this list. Les Morts d'Arthur should definitely be an work of fantasy that you read. But the Arthurian pastiches are thick on the ground. Not a lot of them are very good, but some of them on this list, the ones on this list are worth your time, including this, which is the strangest of them all. This is the Book of Merlin by T.H. White, who is famous as being the author of The Once and Future King, which is a long work of Arthurian pastiche. It's a long Arthurian novel, and this was originally intended to be the final part of that book. That book is in 4 parts, each one of which is quite long enough to stand as its own thin book. This is too, but it's different from all the rest of the sort of the Once and Future King. It doesn't have a plot. It has no action. It doesn't have a climax, except for what everybody in the book knows is going to happen from before the first page. It's instead a book-long meditation on the pros and cons of humanity. And I know that must sound like an absolute snoozer of a book, but this is magical, purely magical, the most magical book on this list. Uh, it's a huge favorite of mine. I guess I don't recommend reading it before you've read The Once and Future King, and certainly I wouldn't read it unless you're at least nominally familiar with Arthurian mythos, whether it's Le Morte d'Arthur or Boy's King Arthur or whatever it is. I would save this. I would save it to savor it. But once you are in that position, I think you'll reread this a lot. I've lost track of how many times I've read it. And it is amazing every time. Moves me every time. And we'll stick with Arthurian pastiches here for a little bit. This is a huge work that was hugely popular. This is Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mist of Avalon, which is a feminine but not a feminist retelling of the Arthurian cycle. It tells the Arthurian cycle and throws its emphasis on the several women who play pivotal parts in that cycle, that have all along. They play it in the medieval versions. They certainly play it in Malory. What Marion Zimmer Bradley does here, and does wonderfully, very atmospherically, is throw the emphasis of the plot line onto those women. Doesn't shunt anybody, doesn't hate anybody, doesn't hate any sex. It's just, it's the Arthurian cycle seen through a different lens, and very effectively. Then, okay, this next was another big, fat, collected volume. It's many thin volumes. You should read all of the volumes. You should know them. You shouldn't just read them and throw them out the window. You should read them and know them. And I say that even though I don't like them myself. They're absolutely fundamental to so much of what fantasy does, not least because they were the formative reading of a lot of the big names in the genre today. And that is the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Here in a big fat one volume that was reissued for one of the movies, I think, the first of the movies. Of course, if you're going to have a big one-volume paperback of the Chronicles of Narnia, you want Tilda Swinton on the cover, right? Of course you do. It would be nice if she could be on the cover of every book. but you want her on the cover of this. She might be on the cover of Lord of the Rings if she had won out for the part of Galadriel, but she was otherwise occupied. And this is, of course, the king of all allegories. It's a hugely allegorical tale about Christianity. I am not a fan of allegory. I always consider it to be just sort of sneaking a Sunday lecture in by the back door. But it's also wonderful. And the idea, the archetypes here of the little children escaping to a fantasy world through a wardrobe, it'll stick with you. This has imprinted itself on generations of readers. Okay, and then this next one, sticking with the theme of children escaping into a fantasy. In Narnia, they do it literally. And in this next book, it happens much closer to the way that you and I escape into fantasy. This is Michael Ende's book, Neverending Story. And it starts off, the gimmick that starts it off is a miserable, outcast, bullied boy who takes refuge in a book of fantasy. That is the fantasy that we start to see in this story. And he loses himself in the book, and every reader is going to be nodding along, who hasn't had that experience, who hasn't loved it, including with a lot of the books on this list. And later on, he starts to realize or starts to think that the story in the book is aware of him, which again is something that diehard readers have often felt, whether they're living in a fantasy land or not. So definitely wanted to include it. Very much a rereadable book. And then we'll go back to Arthurian pastiches. I've already mentioned this. This is The Once and Future King by T.H. White, the greatest Arthurian pastiche of them all, and also, no offense to Thomas Malory, the greatest telling of the Arthurian story that's ever been done. You may be familiar with this book. If you haven't read it, you may be familiar with it because the first book, the first huge segment in this, The Sword and the Stone, has often been published, I think is still in print, as a separate standalone YA book, telling the story of a young boy named Wart, who pulls a sword out of a stone and becomes right-wise king of all England, and his tutor Merlin and all of the various shape-shifting adventures that they have. That was made into a book on its own, and I think a lot of people read that book and love it without realizing it's part of a bigger book. And the bigger book is worth their discovering because the wonderful sunlight and adventurous whimsy of The Sword and the Stone is nowhere present in the rest of this. The rest of this becomes darker and more nuanced and more adult than almost any fantasy novel I can think of. It is just the same story. There are fantasy elements involved here. Wart transforming into all sorts of animals at the beginning is not the only fantasy element in here. There are fantastical beasts, one of which is very lovelorn, and also an enchantress. of course. The enchantresses, and Merlin is all throughout this, and the enchantresses of the Arthurian cycle are in here as well. I cannot praise this enough. I really can't. I know that it's still in print. There are many, many previous editions out there for, for dirt cheap. If you see this at your used bookstore or your yard sale and you've never read it, but you've heard about it, grab it. It is amazing. It is amazing. Difficult to put into words. Of all the books on this list, this is the one guaranteed to make its fans stumble for words, to explain how wonderful it is, how adult it is, how respectful of your intelligence it is, how respectful of moral ambiguity it is. I mean, you can see that in the bare bones of the Arthurian story, right? King Arthur becomes best friends and raises to the highest position in the land a man who is going to fall helplessly in love with King Arthur's wife. That is a minefield of moral and ethical ambiguity, and this book does it justice. Almost no other Arthurian retellings that I know of do, but this one does. Then we'll move to another classic, an odd classic here. This is Silverlock by John Myers Myers. As you can see from the old cover there, one of the characters in this book is a man from our own time, has an academic degree and everything. And he travels to a strange fantasy world where all sorts of characters, both made up and especially characters pulled out of other fantasies, like the Arthurian cycle or the Robin Hood cycle, they populate this world, and he has adventures with them that are wonderful. And if you are reading plucked from our world, intermingling with weird fantasy characters that are known also characters drawn from old folklore, if you're reading books like that now, this is where they come from. And this is wonderful, so why not read this? Then we have something, I wavered back and forth on putting this on this list. It is a trip. It's a trippy book, which is a phrase that we used to use back in the 60s and 70s to refer to a book that is supposed to blow your mind, man. It's supposed to simulate a peyote trip. And because it is so ill-defined and wanders all over the place narratively, it's often on people's science fiction lists, not their fantasy list. I put it on my fantasy list because I don't think there's much science fiction in it. This is David Lindsay's book of Voyage to Arcturus. Never mind the horrible cover here. I couldn't find the cover of the mass market paperback that was in print in America for a long time, and that I used to hand out like M&Ms to people. And this is nominally the story of traveling to the star Arcturus. In this book, that star is a binary system. It is not. And the characters go through all sorts of philosophical and sociological discussions of various worlds and various concepts of world building. I think it gets a little bit tedious, but a lot of writers have been influenced by this. This is what you would refer to as a cult classic. If A Dragon Waiting is a cult classic, this is a mega cult classic, and therefore, I think, deserves to be on this list. Then we get to classic fantasy. This is Fletcher Pratt's The Well of the Unicorn, with another Darrell K. Sweet cover. What I wouldn't give for a Darrell K. Sweet cover of Voyage to Arcturus. Maybe he's done it, and I just don't know. He seems to have done a cover for every fantasy that's ever been done, including Lord of the Rings, which I would have put on here, but I wanted to stress that it's one book. But this is standard fantasy fare, warring kingdoms, epic magic systems and whatnot, but just wonderfully done. Just wonderfully, playfully, artistically done. In a vein, in a way that has been often imitated but never equaled. So if you are spending your fantasy reading time reading the imitations, why not go back to the original? I hope that The Well of the Unicorn is in print. In the UK, there's a fantasy masterpiece series that does a lot of good stuff. They include a lot of things that I would not have expected them to include. Maybe they have The Well of the Unicorn. That would be great if they do. My only beef with the Fantasy Masterpiece series in the UK is the boring covers. But you can put up with a boring cover. Then we have something that's very old, very formative. Lots and lots of fantasy writers go back to this author. This book is not particularly my favorite among the things he did, but still very much worth your time to read. This is The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. This funky old 1960s paperback cover. I think a UK cover. Again, broad tapestry fantasy, all of the normal gimmicks that you would expect, but done with a wonderful eloquence. The only problem with this, it's not really a problem. There are problems with A Voyage to Arcturus. You should do it. I almost put Islandia on this list. as in terms of a trippy cult classic book. But I think nobody reads Islandia anymore, and I know people read A Voyage to Arcturus still. But though those are difficult uphill asks in a different way. This is an ask because of the diction that E.R. Edison uses. He uses his own made-up diction here, his own made-up kind of English that takes a little getting used to. If you can get used to all the other stuff, if you can get used to 9 pages of expositional vocabulary drills in Brandon Sanderson, I think you can get used to this. And the payoff is a lot greater. And this is also very, very influential. So don't worry, we're getting close to the end here. We have 2 more to go. This next one is a perfect example. Actually, these next 2 are perfect examples of what I was talking about all the way at the beginning, of books that straddle the line, or seem to, between science fiction and fantasy. So, if you're dead set on reading an essentials list of fantasy, and you read one of these things, you will notice some science fiction elements. I think it mainly just comes down to the kind of feel that the author was trying to convey. And this next one, the author was extremely familiar with fantasy and science fiction. If anybody's allowed to straddle the borderline between the two, it's Gene Wolfe. This is, of course, the Book of the New Sun. This is a 1-volume collection of the first 2, Shadow of the Torturer and Claw of the Conciliator. There are others that you can get them as individual Timescape mass market paperbacks online. They might be expensive, but you can do it. Or you can get these. Tor makes these in 2 volumes to include 4 books. And these are amazing. They are sumptuously, wonderfully written, wonderfully complex. This author was a wonderful man. He was, believe it or not, ironically a terrible storyteller, even though the storytelling in these books is great. But it doesn't matter, because these are they bristle with intelligence and originality. The main character, the main conduit of the story, a man named Severian, will get on your nerves, but he's supposed to. So, and then we'll finish up this list with a favorite of mine, an overwhelming favorite of mine, that also straddles the borderline between science fiction and fantasy. The books that straddle the dividing line between science fiction and fantasy tend to do it in only a handful of ways. It will be a science fiction book like The Dragon Riders of Pern, or where the characters in the book don't know that it's science fiction, but we do. And then another way that that this often happens is that the science fiction in the book has decayed and fractured to the point where it looks like fantasy. And again, the characters don't know one way or another. I think this might be the latter. This is, of course, the great Vesperonium cycle by M. John Harrison. This is the lovely trade paperback that came out in the U.S. about 20 years ago. That includes all of the Vesperonium writings. There are novels and there are short stories, and they're all in this book. And the book is not long. The novels were not long. Finding the individual novels might be a bit of a trick in the second-hand market, but this volume is out there. And for all I know, in the UK there's an essentials volume of Vesperonium with a boring cover. But these are amazingly written. They are amazingly good. About a world so old, about Vesperonium, about a world so old that it has outlived even time. It doesn't even remember what it is, and has no idea whether or not the artifacts that are dug up in the irradiated wastes are magic or real. The Vesperonium story, A Storm of Wings. Oh no, the Vesperonium story that's ultimately about an alien invasion is the weirdest alien invasion story you'll ever read. And is never referred to that way. None of the characters have any idea what's going on, and you don't either for a lot of it. But Harrison, writing in his prime like this, is so wonderful so that this is absolutely essential. You can read the rest of M. John Harrison. He's still writing today, and he writes some very good contemporary science fiction. But yeah, if you're reading fantasy, if you're a big fantasy fan, if this is your genre, and you either read very little outside this genre or nothing at all outside this genre, then you have to read this. You absolutely have to read this. You owe it to yourself to read this and all the other essentials on this list. This is a list of fantasy essentials. If you cover these, you have covered the essentials. It's a lot of reading here. A lot of these things are multiple books, but well worth it. If you cover these, you've covered the essentials. And then you can go on to wait in line for the latest Cosmere book. You can do that with a clear conscience because you will have read these essentials. So there you go. So I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.